When you think about craft, all of a sudden you begin to realize that there's a danger where you begin to fetishize the idea of craft. And you lose the idea that basically craft is about an idea rather than the craft. It's what happens when people try to make something perfect rather than making the idea perfect.
I think craft in some respects, largely because of budget constraints and things like that, is something that we focus less on now in our projects. But when we were doing it ourselves and out there nailing it or welding it or whatever it was that we were called upon to do, I mean, we were interested in having that be perfect and timeless, all the other things that we were jazzed about when we started the company out of school.
The craft that I appreciate are done by people who understand the material. And so because of that, they give respect to the material and they want to learn what that material can do.
I mean, craft is just the idea of making something by hand, I guess. I don't,
That's a good question.
I think it's a good question. I don't know.
I don't know if it is.
Yeah,
It sort of started that way, just like a drawing used to be defined like, what's a drawing?
That's right.
You draw a piece of paper by hand. Well, that's changed now. It's like you do it digitally, you do it by film and all that stuff. So the definition has changed, but I think that is very much part of it. Like,
I think craft is an evolving, broad word that really just talks about how humans create the built world. I mean, isn't that really all it is? And how you take materials from wherever, whatever they might be, whether they be, wood or digital materials or whatever, and you somehow form them into the thing, be it a plate or a glass or a building or whatever.
But it's something you're starting out with. You're trying to invent something or solve something at the beginning. I mean, there's sort of an intent. You're going somewhere and you're kind of wanting to explore and try a new direction, but you have an idea of someplace where you're going. And I think it's that process that it almost becomes more the craft than the final product.
I mean, almost what we're talking about is not craft as much as like thinking about craft and how to get craft in sync with your ideas and what you care about. And it's that in syncness that I think is so fascinating and challenging.
Well said.
I agree 100%. I mean, we're in this building that was probably virtually built by hand.
Drawings on 3 sheets.
Exactly, and the imperfections in this table are
Obviously, they didn't have a piling drive, by the way.
Exactly. The fact that bricks are about the size of your hand, or the fact that lumber is at a certain size. There's all of these sort of humanness scale to the thing and how it's fabricated. Ultimately, but the question I kind of had in my mind is that isn't necessarily craft. That's maybe an old way of looking at craft.
Right.
It's maybe somewhat romantic and sentimental. We're doing a project right now which I could argue is in fact craft, but it is almost entirely digitally modeled, sent to a fabricator that fabricates it on robots, basically.
Based off your drawing.
Based off those drawings, very little hand is touched. They are doing joints that we can't conceivably do anymore because of the cost of labor. Is that craft? And I think it is craft.
Of course it is.
Yeah, sure.
But there's something almost disturbing about that,
I like the idea that technology is in there because it kind of frees us up and it's exploratory in its own way. Digital fabrication is a huge release. It's a huge freedom for us all, but it's got its own albatross. Sometimes it kind of turns into wanton fetish, in which, are you solving something or are you just making something look beautiful?
Well, I think what gives that sort of wabi-sabi moment in that sort of a perfectly controlled process or production is your desire to explore. And I feel like that's a really important part for me when I think about craft is like, I don't have any opposing opinion about that craft is perfecting the skill, that's been passed on from generation to generations. But I think that your desire to explore with this material that you've had it all your life and your previous ancestors, I think that gives that moments of imperfectness or the humanness that it receives.
Well, that's where a machine will make it perfect, and it doesn't necessarily allow you to explore. And I think exploration is the real key. And we've all been involved in projects where sometimes the anomalies are more important than the original idea.
Sure.
They're accidents, and you happen to be there on the site when they happened. The craftsperson might have even wanted to eliminate it or change it, but whoa, don't do that.
Yeah.
Right.
I think more and more now, craft, because of technology and because of who's actually doing the final fabrication or whatever, is a whole bunch of different people, and they all have to be kind of on the same wavelength.
So I'm curious to know when in this design process, people involve the craftsperson or the metal fabricator or making the call to the laser cutter or whenever. Because I know that I'm not, billing hours driving out to all these places all the time to figure this stuff out. At some point in the process, when do we, or do we all at this table solicit sort of an outside impression like, oh, that's a really stupid idea, or this is possible, let's push it this way?
I think that's a
earlier-
really good question.
Maybe earlier than ever.
Yeah, and I think the mistake architects make is they think they have to invite the craftsperson at a certain time. I don't think you invite the craftsperson at a certain time. You invite the craftsperson throughout your life, if that makes any sense. So you're learning from that person every time you work with that person, so that when you're working on a project, you know when, you know how, and you have a lot of respect for what they can bring to the table, because I don't know if there's a line in the sand. If it's a schematic when the idea is being generated, maybe, sometimes absolutely. You know the personality, you know the person, you've made that contact. You can then begin to develop this idea. Maybe sometimes it's later when the thing is actually being fabricated on the site. Maybe it's a person out on the site that you engage.
But maybe you design something knowing that there's this craftsperson that can do it, and then you have this lifetime or ongoing relationship, and that person changes you. Their ability is influencing its sort of relationship.
And what's important, it's a back and forth. There are those crafts people out there that don't listen to architects, and there are architects that don't listen to the crafts people or don't have an idea of craft. And I think it is a classic communication. It's that point where all of a sudden something has to translate from this to that.
Well, there's the idea of architecture that's just the idea of architecture, which isn't a thing, right? It's just this thing we hold in our heads, But it seems like the moment it's the thingness of it, that then you can't avoid the craft, and
Do you guys think that architecture has to be built? Do you think that's a...
Depends on if it's your building or not.
Depends if you want to keep the rain out.
And maybe that's kind of impossible to answer, but as a practitioner, I have an easy answer, but I'm not sure I'm right.
What's your answer?
I think it has to be built. I think you have to go to Zumthor's spa. Right. There's very few pieces of architecture that have actually moved me. Very few. And I think about those places. The spa is one of them, and I know they are stunningly complete at all levels. Brion, absolutely agree. It almost brings you to tears when you walk in.
It is the moment that the ideas intersect with the craft, is when it comes to exist. That craft is about it existing as a physical object.
So you're saying the same thing then?
Yeah.
That it has to be built?
Well, no, I'm saying that you could take architecture as an idea, and then when you add craft in, then it becomes the physical object that's architecture. That you can't, that architecture can exist without craft, and it's simply, drawings or discussions or...
I do think the drawing is craft.
I know, I knew you were going to say that.
But your question wasn't that so much as architecture, does it have to be built? Which is different than is drawing craft, right? And you're ultimately you're saying yes.
I was proposing that.
Yeah, and I think it's sort of interesting because I think, I can go both ways thinking like you can look at these beautiful drawings, whether if it's in comic books or architect sketches, and like it's amazing, But at the same time, when Michael Heiser's piece at DS Center, when it came to life, because that was drawn in like 70s or something, right?
The Four Continents?
Yeah.
Jeez.
It was amazing,
It's
like to go there.
write that one
And it just kind of, I got really emotional, like surprisingly, like it kind of I got all teared up and I was like, what's happening? And it's that experience of seeing something real. Like, I think it would be different than if I were to look at the drawings and being inspired by, than having something that is real that you get to experience. And so I think that's kind of the potency of architecture, or three-dimensional experiences, that it's built. It's like a real life experience. You get to occupy that space.
I agree, and I want to follow on something that Roy was saying, because I can go both ways too, and I can kind of agree with what Roy's saying. So I had this, it's a real honor to have Juhani Palausma write something in my new book. And if you know Juhani, it's all about realness. And in it he says that there have been paintings that have moved me to places that I wasn't. And why wouldn't a photograph of architecture do the same? Or why couldn't a drawing of architecture do the same? So is that architecture? I don't think he really answers that question.
I was
had to
thinking
agree.
the reverse, that craft is something that can't be appreciated in photographs somehow. You know, that like maybe that's a condition where, you know, it just shouldn't, if you haven't been there, you haven't touched the metal or whatever, you just, it has not exist.
I mean, I kind of agree until he wrote that thing. I go, well, fair point.
Yeah.
But I do think we're moving into, I mean, the future, it seems like this definition will come under attack from all quarters, whether that's, you know, the craft of putting together presentation drawings to creating, you know, virtual environments for, you know, first-person shooter games or whatever, you know, whatever that is will become increasingly potent. And I think architecture should be built and one should experience it, but I also think that these definitions, like I hope it's not nostalgia that we're like, well, it should be built and that's why it should be good. And, you know, we all go to movies and cry, and that's, I mean, that's a real experience, but I could imagine being in some virtual environment and being moved as well.
I was lucky to travel through Mali a couple of years ago with some architects. And it was interesting because there is a recognizable seamlessness between what's made and what's there and how people live with those objects. This is a very common locking mechanism from Mali. When I first saw it, I loved it because in its crudeness, it was handmade by somebody for their own house. It is the way you enter the house. It is the symbol of what was important to the builder of this piece. And I am attracted to things that are made by hand. I am attracted to seeing how the hand made this and why the antlers are a little bit different sized, why there's sort of these sort of scratchy symbols, and it's a useful thing. And I think maybe that speaks to my architecture because there's an idea here about something, there's an idea here about culture, about religion, about life. It locks the front door, and it's something that reminds the inhabitants of the place every day that they use it.
So this is an object that I walked into this salvage yard, and there was this huge pile of these things that both Northwest Steel and the Olympic Foundry would just dumped. And I immediately was attracted to what I thought was the beauty of the object first and foremost. I brought it here tonight because it represented to me some of the things that we've been discussing, you know, that this is something that was made, you know, it's the negative for something positive, not the object itself. I think of that in terms of like craft not being an end in itself. Like our purpose is not to, for me anyway, is not to like obsess about having someone recognize that it is like this highly crafted thing. If there's an idea behind what this is and how it performs, and you can imagine that this object would be very interesting three-dimensionally and things like that, but that is the main reason that it was brought, was this sort of relationship, this dialogue that we all might have as people who think and draw instructions foremost for someone else to make, and what the relationship is between those things.
Tools are sort of easy object. It's a drill. You know, it's a very useful utilitarian object. And not only that, there's sort of aesthetic application to that also, and this like specific color has been applied. I mean, it could have been just left as a steel color. It would have been fine too, but whoever made this chose the cherry wood and this orange color. And I feel like anything that I see as kind of a craft or a craftsman has that aspect about it. The person who made it has a kind of aesthetic preference to that object or that project, and they apply that, and you get to appreciate it. And when I thought of the word craft kind of felt right in between, as something that's totally non-functional, aesthetic, kind of an abstract idea making versus problem solving and producing things.
My object has never had a human hand touch it. I'm sure it was completely computer generated and then manufactured in China. It's an IKEA lamp. People who are really interested in a few things about it that I find compelling, and one of them is that it's solar. That part there comes out and can be charged separately, and it's got this sort of nice handy handle, but I think the real secret is right in there. If you look at it, see the little square in the middle?
Yeah.
It's an LED light. It's 1.2 watts.
Oh, that's it. So that's the bulb and everything.
Yeah. So it's this really little bright light source. It's really bright if you look at it.
Yeah, that is amazing.
What I find so interesting about it was that there was real care in it. There was an idea behind it. And the idea was to deliver good quality task light, low energy, and then be able to reproduce it using solar in this particular case. And I think this idea in here is really liberating. And I think anything we can do to lower our energy thing is something that we should be striving for. And here is a group of people who invented these different things, who drew this all on a computer for a very reasonable price with a product that I think is kind of remarkable. So is this craft? I think it is.
I cheated, I brought two. I thought they dialogued well together. This is a vase done by a local artist we all know, Jeffrey Mitchell, in the last year or two probably. And this is a coffee cup and saucer done by, I think his name is Harold Dixon, out of San Diego in the 50s. And we've been talking about craft in lots of ways, and I think we didn't really come up, but we've been talking about craft with a little c and craft with a big C, which is, one way to kind of differentiate. This coffee cup is sort of, modern in the stripped down nature of it, and, came out of the modern craft movement in the 50s, but it's obviously a very special thing in that it's clearly carefully handmade, but yet it has slight deformities of just the throwing and the glaze, and it's clearly just a very carefully handmade object but was most likely part of a set and made to be used and not just a contemplative object. And then Jeff's is, I would say, lovingly less carefully made, but yet lovingly made. And being object sensitive people, we love seeking discriminators of looking for where you find love within objects. For me, in craft, it is the expression of humans making objects, and because those objects are visible, I think that people are trying to imbue love of existence within those objects in a way that then exists in kind of solid, ongoing form that gets to sit there and be seen.
What you're saying is absolutely right. There's a hand in each one of these, and a very personal hand. There's like a record of the two different.
Well, there's a mind. There's a loving being within
absolutely.
Each of that.
And I think that is what happens when something reaches beyond just being perfectly crafted or a good idea not well crafted, because that happens too. Good ideas are not well crafted.
Like, what's the difference between something that might be well crafted in like an idea sense and something that you would just reject as workmanship?
Yeah, it's tough, and of course that exactly. There is, and in my lectures I call it skiing the trees, because I grew up skiing, but I long ago understood that when you ski the trees, the idea is to get through the trees, right, and not hurt yourself. But you can't figure out how you're getting through those trees. I mean, it's insane. You're making minute decisions, nuanced decisions based on your skill. And the better you do it, the more elegantly you do it, if that makes sense. You're using less energy, you're being smart about it, and you're making these skillful decisions. And I think that is sort of when things are really working, and we all know they're working with the craft and the idea and everything, we're not necessarily knowing where we're going to end up, but we're sort of following and letting those anomalies sort of happen, and then we work with the anomalies. Because I think that seems to be what the craft is all. It's the drawing, it's the idea, it's the fabrication, it's those nuanced sort of decisions that happen, and ultimately you know it when it's done. If it gets built and you walk in, those few moments when architecture actually does transcend, it was all there.